to understanding the climate science. So I thought I'll take just a few minutes, and I'll just take one slide, basically, to be able to explain to you this concept. Let's see, did you say I press this? I'm not getting it. Okay, so once he's going to fix this, just please remember this, that this is property of matter, any matter, table, chair, earth, you, our human bodies. We are constantly radiating energy, 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. That's the fundamental law of physics, and the amount of energy you radiate is actually depends upon the temperature. So I have one slide to explain to you why it gets cold at night, why there are ice ages, why there is a warm season and cold season during this. So just remember this concept that the total amount of energy that is coming from sun, and we get heated only during the day, so we cool 24 hours a day. So the reason it doesn't get cold during the daytime is because the sun actually compensates for that. So the fundamental property that we are losing energy all the time. It's a huge amount of energy. You will be surprised the total is 120 trillion watts of energy coming in and going out. It's a very delicate balance. And the amount of energy that comes depends on the sun, but the amount of energy that leaves depends upon the temperature and also the amount of carbon dioxide in the atmosphere. You just remember, see this, we have big energy coming in, going depends upon the temperature. It's a very non-linear function of temperature. Hotter you are, you release a lot more energy. Hotter, I mean by temperature-wise. And so if you compare the two, the difference is very small. And that temperature at which the both energies are similar is called climate. So for Earth, that happens at 15 degrees centigrade. That's why if you take all the points of the globe and average them, the temperature is 15 degrees. 100 years ago, it was 14 degrees centigrade. And I'll explain to you then what has happened. It is that imbalance that determines the climate change. So, for example, if sun is changing, that's what gives you ice ages, because of the axis of rotation changes, okay, the precision changes. But if you change the carbon dioxide and the temperature, then you change the global temperature. So this has been actually a very simple scientific understanding that we have had for more than 100 years. So if people tell you that, oh, climate is always changing, you know, they are actually being funny, and also they are being clever. It's changing, but we understand the mechanism why it is changing. Okay, for this. So if you look at the temperature for the last 100 years, there's nobody in the world, except some small group of people in Washington, D.C., the Republican Party, who do not believe that this change for 100 years is because of the human activity. But you just can't say that simply, just because carbon dioxide is increasing and temperature is increasing. So how do you prove? Well, that is the job the IPCC, Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, for the last 20 years has been doing. And in order to do that, you need a climate model. Now, I cannot explain to you what a climate model is in 30 seconds, but just remember it's about 100 million equations that are solved in every 1 minute time step for 100 years. And therefore you need a supercomputer. So this is the biggest advantage in our science, to develop these climate models. And right now, there are about 39 models in the world, okay, in 13 countries. And here's the important thing. For those who tell you that climate science is doubtful, it's a hoax, and so on. All models give the same result. It's not percentage. 100% of all the models give the same result. And the result is that you cannot explain that temperature change that I showed you unless you look at the influence of the humans. Unless two factors, greenhouse gases and deforestation. So that basically is the science. And we know enough now, and we have enough confidence about the science, that we can also now make predictions about the next 100 years. The biggest uncertainty in making predictions is we don't know what the humans will do. So we have to look at scenarios. But if we continue to do what we are doing to the planet, we are going to go at 4.5 degrees centigrade, global mean temperature. In the last 100 years, it has been 1 degree. Why it is so bad? Paris Agreement, we agreed that it shouldn't go beyond 2 degrees. Hopefully 1.5 degrees. That was what happens at 2 degrees? 140,000 years ago, it was 2 degrees warm. Sea level was up by 5 meters. So the amount of impact on agriculture, health, inequality, disease. I mean, it just is, there's a whole reports that are based on that. That's why you want to do that. So I think that was sort of my sort of 5-minute summary of science. I think just for the purpose of our discussion later on, I just wanted to remind you what India's commitments were to the Paris Agreement, and it's amazing what India is doing. After all, India and Indian leaders are faced with the challenge of the dual goal of enhancing the human development index of its population, obviously, and at the same time, we have to take care of the planet and the environment. And India has made very, very bold sort of commitments, and guess what? It is actually meeting it. I mean, this is the, say for example, proposal for 175 gigawatts, and Mr. Munjal will probably tell us more that how well and how Indian policies are actually doing it. I think so far as my contribution to this discussion is concerned, I just listed, I'm not going to talk about them in great detail, but I really think that India needs a major assessment. There's simply no national climate assessment that USA does every 4 years. How every sector will be affected, how every region of the country will be affected. Because without that information, the local policymakers and the business community, how they can take action, we need that. And we must adapt to extreme events. By the way, 1 degree, 2 degrees warming, people don't feel 2 degrees global warming. That's almost like saying you have a fever. Oh, your fever is high. The real disease inside is really what you have to find out. That's the symptom. Extreme events is how the climate change manifests itself. Manifestation of climate change is through extreme events that affect society in a tremendous way. And I think that I'm hoping that somebody will make sure that India has its own Clean Air Act and Clean Water Act, just like the United States. I mean, this is an amazing change. Of course, Indian Supreme Court has been big help in sort of passing once in a while. And the four topics that I just mentioned there, because they are my favorites, we really need to know how to capture the goal. I mean, you have to go negative. You have to go. I think solar and wind microgrids are my favorite. I think energy efficient building codes. And boy, look at all the air conditioners which are humming all over Delhi and Bombay when you go. We really need super efficient air conditioners. Thank you very much.
So, Himanshu, I think you're next.
Well, I can't, thanks Rob, I can't present any much more than what Dr. Shukla had presented. But I guess when the organizers mentioned to me about the theme of the conference, which was on disruptions in India because of climate change, I could talk about, I could think of 2 or 3 major themes. One is disruptions happening in businesses, which is, you have the utilities around the world, not just around the world, but also in India, like NTPC moving to solar. And you have similar case studies in France, where the largest utility of France, Engie, restructuring its business model towards renewable energy and phasing out all the coal from the system. Then the other disruption I could think of was on the social disruption, which is, a lot of researchers, social researchers, have linked the ISIS, the form, the birth of ISIS to the prolonged droughts in Iraq and Syria back in 2007, 2008. So if you try and apply the same setting in India, are we going to see something drastic with our neighbors because of climate change? And we know that Pakistan and Bangladesh will be one of the most affected countries because of climate change. And the third is on the disruption in the mindsets of people. I guess to any CEO I've talked to and any policymaker I've talked to, I think there are very few cases where people try and de-link growth and climate change policies. So I guess disruption is happening, and it's happening for good. And it will be in India's benefit to actually leverage on that disruption and become a leader in the entire climate change debate, which I think this is where India is heading to anyway.
I think it's Robert. You're next.
I think I'm more comfortable standing. So one of the professors would tell me this is a joke. He'd say there are two solar systems, they cross paths, and one solar system asks our solar system, how's everything? So our solar system turns around and says, oh, everything's okay. I have a small disease called human in my earth, but they are self-destructive. Don't worry. They will destroy themselves at some point. Anyhow, that's how the fear-mongering started, and that's how we got noticed, and that's how people realized that climate change is actually a problem and something needs to be done. And I think we've moved very far ahead from those days, and there is a lot of proof to talk about what all is being done now. I want to stick to 2 or 3 basic facts that I know. 45% of climate is because of electricity, because of the carbon emitted due to electricity. About 25% is due to vehicles. So about 65% is because of electricity and vehicles, which I think I know a little about, because my business is renewable energy, and my family business is motorcycles. Renewables, and what is happening to renewables in the world, and why is it that today we are optimistic that this 2% or 1.5% can be met, and how quickly it can be met. I don't think the answer is in a moral answer, I don't think it's an ethical answer, I think it's an economical answer. The last bid that was won by my company for solar in India was at roughly 2 rupees 55 paisa per unit, and I think I beat Sumant there, but then he beat me on the next bid. So we are winning bids at which are at least 30-35% lower than thermal energy. So it's a monetary issue. Today, when solar has reached this pricing, I don't think it makes economic sense for anybody, especially in a country like India, where there is extreme poverty, to go in for any other form of energy. Of course, we have challenges. It's an intermittent technology. Of course, it requires lots and lots of land. It requires, there are enough challenges, there are no doubt. But the fact is that there is storage, which is right around the corner. Today, lithium ion might not be as cost effective as we want it to be, but we know for a fact that now that China started manufacturing it and they've created 14 or 15 gigawatt hours worth of factories, it's a matter of time where the cost of battery storage goes down just the way cost of solar has. And I don't see that happening. I see it happening in the next 2 years, in fact. Moving on to electric vehicles. Indian government has started making lots and lots of noise. Typically, that's how the government starts. First the government makes noise, then there is a narrative, then that turns into debate, that turns into policy, and finally the policy gets implemented. So I'm very happy to say that noise is started, the debate is starting. In fact, our transport minister in one of his recent meetings had said, for those who understand Hindi, anybody who's not into electric vehicle, मैं उनका बैंड बाजा बना दूंगा. So, so when you have transport ministers making such statements, industry does start to take notice. But the corollary is, the policy is still not out, but it's a matter of time, now that the narrative is so strong. So, of course, we have a problem of climate change. And the good thing is, we have a solution. And we have a solution that is economically viable. And I think if India can do it, then most parts of the other world should be able to do it a lot easier. Thank you.
Thank you. Hello, everybody. So the problem of speaking after a colleague is that he's already talked about a lot of the things that I might have talked about. But I'll just synthesize a little bit of what we all heard. I think Dr. Shukla talked about the issue of climate change. He presented some numbers, and those numbers are actually very relevant. The reality is that we are allowed, based on the models that have been put out by various scientists, we're allowed to basically put out only about 800 gigatons of carbon into the atmosphere. And today, we are already at about 550 gigatons. and we're doing about 30 gigatons every year, which means that we really have, sorry, not 30, but 10 gigatons every year, which means that we have only about 25, 30 years in which we're going to actually exceed 800 gigatons, which really takes us beyond 2 degrees centigrade. So it's inevitable that we're going to actually exceed the 2 degrees centigrade target. I think there's no force on earth that is now going to prevent that from happening. And so therefore, all the consequences, the dire consequences of sea level rise and all of these disruptions that are going to be caused by that, certainly are going to visit us. And there's no way for us to now escape that. And the unfortunate part is that instead of humanity as a whole driving in the direction of trying to prevent it even harder now, we're actually, with all the precipitous tendencies we're seeing with respect to US positions and so on, that whole action is actually becoming much weaker than it was earlier. And that's actually very, very disheartening. But I think there is good news here. There is always a silver lining. And the silver lining in our case is the fact that, as Rahul said, a large part of the carbon in the atmosphere is getting emitted by electricity and mobility. And for both of those, solutions are now emerging. And the reality is now, with renewable energy getting so cheap, there is no reason for anybody in the world now to be adding anything but renewable energy for future capacity additions. So in actual fact, what is happening is now that we are now on the cusp of, in some ways, a third energy transition. And that transition is really moving from fossil fuels to renewables. And I think it's crept up on all of us much faster than we'd anticipated. Because literally till a year and a half, 2 years ago, the cost of renewables was actually a lot higher than it is right now. And it is really only in the last year or so that costs have come down to a point where it is much cheaper than fossil fuels. And therefore, there are two different kinds of transitions that are happening. First, in the developing world, where the demand for power is still going up, all new capacity addition is coming, or actually should be coming out of renewables, more than out of any fossil fuel-based capacity. And in the developed world, where there is no real demand growth taking place, if anything, there's actually shrinkage of demand because of energy efficiency improvements, in those countries, what you're actually seeing is replacement. As fossil fuel capacity gets retired, you're actually seeing new capacity coming up of renewable energy. And I think that is a big transition that is happening. Nobody really is, I don't think policymakers are in any way behind this. I think this is being done really by the markets. And I think going forward, as we look into the future, I think this is something that is going to keep happening even more intensely going forward. And I think with electric vehicles coming in, at least 25-30% of the demand from the mobility side is going to move towards the electricity sector as well. So I think those are all the positives that we are seeing. And when you look at just the renewable sector, because at least that's the sector that I'm from, if you just look at the renewable sector, there are 2-3 different kinds of things that are happening. Number one, more and more utility scale solar and wind farms are now coming up. And solutions around intermittency are now being found. We're now seeing more and more capacity addition happening in the area of storage as well through batteries and so on. And when you look at the cost now of batteries plus renewables, it's actually cheaper than now the cost of fossil fuel. So the question really only is, it's a matter of time before which you start seeing this actually becoming much more prevalent and common. And the second thing that you'll start seeing happening also is the distributed generation side. For off-grid solutions, micro-grid solutions, for people who don't actually have any access to power at this point in time, will start getting access from, again, distributed generation sources of renewables. So I think it's going to actually democratize the supply of electricity to people who didn't actually have it earlier, and it is also going to make it much cleaner and much cheaper. So I think at least there are those solutions that are now beginning to emerge. And this, Himanshu talked about the issue of disruption. This is a massive disruption actually that is upon us in terms of how the electricity markets are structured, how they are geared, how the generation happens, and also how the distribution is going to happen in the future. And I don't think that at this point in time, very many people have thought deeply enough about how this transition is going to happen in the future and what the consequences of that are going to be. Because there will be consequences that are going to range from what happens to the future of utilities all the way to the geopolitics of the Middle East, right? Because suddenly demand for oil is going to start going down, although if you talk to the oil companies, they still are not recognizing the issue of peak oil and so on. So there are lots of consequences of all this that are going to happen that are actually quite fundamentally going to reshape the world order as well. So I think lots of consequences of some of these developments that are taking place, and it's really exciting because they're all of us really in the midst of it, And I presume that since you guys are here, you must be interested in this area. So I think it's very exciting times ahead of all of us. Thank you.
Great, thanks very much, Sumant, and to the whole panel for some very insightful comments on what's going on in India, which really applies to the world, in any case, certainly with regard to renewables. So I think now I'll moderate a discussion for 5 or 10 minutes, and then we'll open it up to questions and comments from the room. So, and any of you, please feel free to guide the discussion in a different direction from where I'm guiding it, if you wish. But first of all, so a question that I think I asked you before the panel, Rahul, to what extent is this disruption, this transition from fossil fuels to renewables, happening as a result of policy, public policy, subsidies included, and to what extent is it happening because of the decrease in the price of the technology involved?
Yeah. So there is actually a third answer, and the third answer is the Prime Minister that we have now. He started a program called the Sun of Sun, if I'm not mistaken, in Gujarat many years ago. And I don't know what excited him or what turned him on to solar energy, but many years back, it's about 12 years back, was it 13 years back? So about 13 years back, he did a very large solar program in the state of Gujarat. And there's something about solar that attracted him. And then he's gone out and made these big promises to the rest of the world, saying, I want to do solar and I want to do renewables. And the way the country is working today, most of the chief ministers and most of the other ministers, in order to impress the Prime Minister, they have to perform. And their performance means doing a lot of renewables. So that's one force which is acting there. Other than that, the other reason is, of course, a commercial reason. Today, commercially, solar is the most viable form of energy there is. It takes less time. What we've seen in the past is, we tried to do some very large thermal projects, which were, thermal generally takes 5 to 7 years to build out. And within 7 years, we've seen the coal prices change, the labor prices change, the material prices change. So by the time you start the project and by the time you finish the project, the cost of the project is, there's a time overrun and cost overrun. And in solar, in thermal, in renewables, we don't see that.
Just to be clear, to make sure everyone is aware, the two of you are CEOs of private independent power producers, which are in the business to make a profit, and would not be in business if you didn't see a profit, right?
No, absolutely, and I think
In the business being renewables.
No, I totally agree with you.
Yeah.
And I think, look, the reality is that ultimately, in both our cases, we have raised a lot of private equity capital, right? And ultimately, these guys are only investing because they see returns, right? And if you really want renewables to proliferate, and if you really want this whole sector to grow, you do need to attract a ton of capital. Because even for the Prime Minister's program of 175 gigawatts of renewables in the next 5 years, we need about $175 billion of total capital, which means about $120 billion of debt and about $50–60 billion of equity. Now that is not available from local sources, or even if it is, the reality is to attract that level of capital, you actually have to provide great returns, otherwise capital is not going to come into the sector. So it is a mix of both policy and the commercials that are attracting or getting the sector to grow. I think in the beginning it was policy driven because you required some degree of subsidization of the sector, but I think now the sector has got to a point where growth is happening on its own because the commercial reasons are so strong now. So for distribution companies in India, which are mostly state-owned, if they can get renewable energy at sub 3 rupees, there is absolutely no reason for them to buy coal-based power at 4 rupees. There's no climate change reason behind this, by the way. It's not on account of any climate change issue, right? It's only because it is cheaper, and India is a very cost-sensitive market.
So I think the answer is clearly both. And I'll just give an example that Mr. Munjal told me just before the break. If you are building a new house, you have to put rooftop solar. And if you don't, you will get fined. And you'll get a letter. You will get a letter that you haven't put it. That's policy. And I was really impressed that someone is pushing it.
So, Himanshu, how about finance? You're in business school. You're getting both an MBA and a Master's of Science in Climate Change from Stanford, and not sleeping. Does the international financial community see this transition in the same way that your colleagues do in the independent power sector?
Absolutely. So in fact, I'm also running a venture, which is called Climate AI, and we actually advise the sovereign wealth funds and endowment funds about their strategies on climate change. And in 1990s, the largest sovereign wealth fund of the world, the Norwegians, they used to get 100% of their incomes from oil and gas assets. And a month ago, they announced that they are divesting from all their fossil fuel assets. So that was a big change in the market signal that they have given us. So what that means is in the entire value chain, from pension funds to private equity funds to IPPs, well, the change is already coming, but since the monster down the line and the upstream value chain is giving you that market signal, you'll see more and more finance being diverted towards climate strategies.
Let me follow up with a quick skeptical question, though. I understand that the Norwegian Sovereign Wealth Fund is a very, very big player, maybe the biggest, although Japan's pension fund is quite big too. Now, are the directors of that fund making this divestment because they're making an ethical statement, or because they see higher returns?
So, in fact, we were talking to the Netherlands pension fund a week ago, and the COO mentioned that they see climate change as a real asset risk. And then second is the reputational risk. And third comes like the ethical risk of doing that. So they want to figure out whether to invest in solar assets along the equator, or in the temperate region, or on the polar. Where is the most risk coming from? And they see climate change not just as a risk, but an opportunity as well.
So, Himanshu, you mentioned, moving on to a different topic, unless there are more comments on this one. Himanshu, you mentioned one type of social disruption that's resulting in part from climate change, which is conflict, resulting from lack of water, which in turn is exacerbated, water shortages are exacerbated by rising temperatures. But another type of disruption is happening in India, where many people who could not afford electricity before can now afford electricity. So the demand for electricity is rising quite rapidly, and I can't remember, one of you referred to air conditioners, and that's okay. That's one indicator of increasing demand and ability to pay for electricity. Can renewables keep up with the huge number of people that are entering the market for electricity in India?
I just speak a couple of lines on that, and of course these guys have a better place to talk about that. I think last year what we saw is the Central Electricity Authority of India coming up with a report that India doesn't need any more coal power plants till 2025. And that's a government authority telling you, we don't need any more coal power plants. So what you see as a result, most of the coal capacity in India in 2017 was running at 58% capacity. And India last year added, I think 9 to 9.4 gigawatts of solar, which was much more than any other power source capacity addition ever.
But just to give you a sense, India is doing quite well as far as renewable energy capacity addition is concerned. We did, as Himanshu said, about 9 to 10 gigawatts last year. We did about 3-4 gigawatts of wind as well. So India is actually the third largest market in the world after China and the US. But just to give you a sense of proportion, China added about 53 gigawatts of solar last year, which is more than 5 times that of what India added. And actually, almost 60% of the global market share was done in one country.
Not necessarily all connected.
I know, I agree with that, but the fact of the matter is, you still need to set it up, you still need to manufacture, set it up. So the point is that we can go at a faster clip in India as well. if government policy is a little bit more supportive, and to the, sort of links into your previous question as well. And the reason why government policy is so important is because if you look at the power sector in India, it is highly unreformed. The distribution companies are all owned by the state governments. The transmission lines are owned by government companies. All the regulatory agencies are appointees of state government chief ministers. So the whole sector is actually fairly unreformed. And therefore the government still has a very heavy hand within the power sector. And that is something that actually needs to be significantly reduced. And I think let markets perform their job, and I think you'll probably find a lot more capacity addition happening.
So I'll speak to the first point of your question. So India per capita energy consumption is really low. It's a third of China. It's probably 1/70th or 1/15th of the US. So per capita consumption of energy in India is going to grow much faster than other parts of the world. A, because white good financing has become much easier. B, like Suman said, the infrastructure is coming in. There wasn't enough grid which is being built out every year. And the cost of energy for the bottom of the pyramid is becoming cheaper and cheaper. So it's becoming absolutely affordable. So with all three coming in, the need for energy is going up much faster. And I think by the year 2019 or 2020, we plan to electrify all the villages there are in the country. And earlier, electrification of a village meant one household per village, which then moved to 10% of the village, which now is going to move to the entire village. So eventually, by 2020, 2022, I think all of India should be covered in energy.
You mentioned about conflict and climate change. I just wanted to tell you that this area of violence and climate change has become such a major topic. Of the number of papers that are being published, all the way starting from the football games, where on hot days they hit each other much harder. This is all published literature to the Department of Defense saying that climate change and refugees, of 100 million, 200 million refugees, is one of the biggest. And there are at least 4 world conflicts, all related to the climate change. Right.
I also remember reading, I think maybe in The Economist, that in the UK, in England, the amount of rain has actually gone up substantially, almost 20-30% higher than it used to be earlier. And as a result of which, a lot of cricket matches are getting rained out. So the popularity of cricket is actually going down because nobody wants to go and watch the matches any longer. So it's raining.
Umbrella sales are going up. Let's open it up. Please, when you ask your question or make a comment, please state your name and also your affiliation, where you're from. I think it would be interesting for the panelists. I saw yours first, so.
Hi, I'm Jeevan. I'm a dual degree of MBA and Environmental Management at Yale. And I'm very curious about the issue of climate change being a global problem, and India and China moving so far ahead in terms of installing renewable energy. But US, they are not no longer in Paris Agreement. Justin Trudeau in Canada is giving mixed signals about oil and renewable energy. So even though you guys are installing a lot of renewable energy, you are still susceptible to the climate change risk because it's a global problem, and there's a lot of low-lying lands there. So energy is good, but what about the climate resilience issues? And what about infrastructure climate resilience? Is that opportunities for you guys there?
Let me just say 15 seconds. The U.S. actually is still in the Paris Agreement and can't leave until early November of 2020, just after our next presidential election. But we have expressed an intention to leave, maybe. Yes, sorry. Anyone?
I just want to make just a simple comment that everything you mentioned had to do with the government. I think that the business community, and here are 2 heroes right sitting in front of us, the business community has accepted it. And therefore, these policymakers, look, I just told you, the entire Republican Party, nobody thinks that humans are affecting climate change. What it is, it's nothing to do with science. It has to do with their influence on it. So, but I think that the business community is going to play a very important role because they are going to make decisions based on economics and not about politics.
Anyone else on resiliency?
I think that's a very well-made point. The latest economic survey of India came up with an analysis that in the short run, climate change is going to impact the farmer's income by 25%. Now this might not sound as significant a figure, but imagine a typical farmer household in India earns 5,000 rupees per month, and out of that 5,000, they spend less than 20 to 25% on education and health. So you're talking about that portion of their income, and the rest goes on like food and daily necessities, being taken away because of India not having climate resilient strategies. You're talking about cascading impact on the growth of the country. Because if farmers are not educated, and agriculture still employs 49% of India's population. So if they're not educated, they're not healthy, productivity will be less, and hence GDP will suffer. But unfortunately, and at least government has taken a step on recognizing on paper through the economic survey, and we hope to see more strategies and policies in the direction of resiliency.
In the back there.
Hi, my name is Abhijit. I'm a PhD student at Northeastern University. Mr. Munjal mentioned contribution of transport to carbon emissions, and I understand that there is a policy on faster adoption of electric vehicles in India. And I did a recent study on replacing electric vehicles with passenger vehicles in India under the current electricity grid mix. And the results are not very good. So what happens is what we call burden shifting. So while there is no tailpipe emissions from electric vehicles, the burden is shifted to thermal power plants where most of the power is generated right now. So the net is still positive carbon emissions. So my question is there a lack of assessments when we adopt new technology, especially with regards to climate change?
No, I completely agree with the question, and I completely agree with your point, and this is what we've also been telling the government, that there is no point moving to electric when you're going to produce energy through thermal. I think the government understands that, and the plans they're talking about are for 2030 and beyond. So by the time it comes in, we will the share of renewables, according to me, by 2025 should be about 20%, and 2030 should be even greater than that. It's almost like the anecdote of McKinsey saying you can't sell more than 900,000 mobile phones by 2000. I don't know if it's the year, but they ended up selling a couple of million, right? So I think the numbers that we look at today at 30, 35, 40%, because most of the Western world, Germany is saying 60% of the energy will come from renewables. So I think when we get there, you'll see India will also be talking about very large numbers.
But I think, I think one of the decisions that should also be taken along with a statement like 2030 electric vehicles will only be sold is to also say that all power for electric vehicles should only come from renewable energy sources. I think that's a fundamental sort of combination or linkage that also needs to be expressly stated by governments. And that's something that we should actually all push for in our respective forums and so on. Because I think that only then makes sense. Otherwise, he's absolutely right that we just, shift it.
Increase.
There's one more element to it, which is of air pollution. So the Lancet study links 2.1 million deaths in India to air pollution. And you know how many deaths occur every year in India because of accidents? 146,000. That's like 1/10 of that. So if not anything, you're looking at co-benefits on the air pollution front, when 30% of your air pollution comes from vehicles.
Sir?
So, given that we spoke, my name is Rahul. I'm a dual degree student at MIT doing MBA and a master's in mechanical engineering. So, given that we spoke about the fact that the economics is what is making renewable energies work now rather than the social side of it. The product is very commoditized. We have the same panels available to everyone in the world. As leaders of business organizations, at least I feel that the financial modeling and the way you structure your business is the way you disrupt a market and become a leader. So have you seen any disruptions in that field that India, particularly related to India, what business models are working more and what are working less?
We are selling energy at 2 rupees 50 paisa. You can't expect any more. Next thing is free. You will have to make money on free energy. No, but the fact that, from 5 rupees just 2 years back to 2 rupees 50 paisa, there's been a lot of work that's gone in the back that you don't see, be it financial modeling. Of course, is a very large part of that role. You want to add anything?
No, the beauty of this business from a consumer standpoint is that there are no real barriers to entry. Okay, and therefore anybody can enter the segment, and that keeps people like us totally on our toes, because if we don't execute well, then obviously somebody else is going to come in and take over our lunch. But I think within that, there are small points of differentiation which, if you keep in mind, if you execute well over a longer period of time, then you can actually be the one that is actually ending up being successful than the other guys are. So there's no magic bullet kind of an answer here. I think you just have to keep working at it, be sensible and be smart, and not get too aggressive in your bidding. So one of the things that has happened, and we're getting into renewables a little bit more, is that across the world, while everybody started off with feed-in tariffs, most countries started off with feed-in tariffs, now everybody is moving to auctions. And partly that's happening because India was so successful in driving down tariffs through competitive auctions, that all policymakers around the world are now recognizing this is the best way to allocate new capacity. And so therefore that's really keeping the markets extremely, extremely tight.
And feed-ins didn't work so well in Germany, so there's a counterexample, right?
Yeah, I think, obviously if feed-in tariffs get set at a very attractive level, then, everybody and their brother rushes in. And on the other hand, if they're too low, then nobody comes in. So for policymakers in an environment where your capital costs are changing so dramatically, setting tariffs was always going to be very difficult. And that was what was proven. But on the flip side, the competitive auction method is also so, it causes such a huge amount of competitiveness in a sense, especially in India, because the way the auction runs is that you can keep bidding and you can see everybody else's bid out there. And you're allowed to revise your price down by 1 paise at a time. And every time somebody revises the price down by 1 paise, then you're allowed to, the whole bid gets extended by another 8 minutes. And so you have 8 minutes to think about whether you want to decrease by another 1 paise or not. And you keep doing that, and before you know it, you're 30, 40 paise below where you actually wanted to be. Just because you get so caught up in the whole bidding process. So I think that's also the other extreme of this.
You have to know your bottom line before you go in, I guess.
And the bids now take up to 16 to 18 hours from the time the bid starts to the time it finishes. So you've been home twice, got ready and come back.
Sure. So Himanshu, you mentioned capacity factor as, actually the question is for you too. Capacity factor of being a little over 50% for the coal plants, which is traditionally higher in other countries for the coal plants. And also the total installation of fossil plants that we have in India is more than the total demand. So that just tells me that something didn't happen the right way. How are we ensuring that we're doing the right thing when we're installing these new wind and solar assets in making sure that we're actually building something that is needed?
So let me come at it from a very different angle. So yeah, the number is 58 or the number is 65, the most recent number. But it is low. It should not be running at 65%. They should be running, and they're not viable at 65%. They get viable only at a much higher PLF. But the reality is, it's a coal. A lot of the problem has got to do with the coal linkages, and what this government did when they re-auctioned the coal, they took away the old coal mines and gave new ones. So the ones which were earlier there, a lot of people didn't have access to coal now, or don't have access to coal right now. So that's one of the problems. And the second problem that we have is energy consumption in the last few years has not gone up as fast as we wanted to. But one of the answers is there is a good reason for it, which is energy efficiency. With the Ujala scheme, if one was to go by the government's numbers, 10 gigawatt of peak hour energy is saved just because of LED bulbs in India. So that's a good thing.
So I think the whole power sector in India has been grossly mismanaged. Okay, what happened about 10-15 years ago is that there was overbuild in the thermal side. Too many people set up capacities, and that should never have been sanctioned or allowed to go ahead to begin with. A lot of them were setting up capacity on the basis of merchant offtake, and on the basis of coal linkages that was then subsequently cancelled, as Rahul said. And at the same time, there was about 25,000 megawatts of gas that was built with no gas in sight anywhere. Okay, so all these assets are now shut, and at least coal is operating at 50 and 60%. The gas guys are totally shut. Okay, so they're not even operating. So there were fundamental mistakes that happened in the design of the entire power sector. And if you think back on it, it actually boggles the mind as to how the government could allow it, and how could private sector people make investments of billions of dollars, how banks could fund all of these things. There's no logic behind it now.
So
right?
we will never have a problem with his resource.
No, so now,
Wind and sun, hopefully.
so now the issue is that with wind and sun at least, it is quite conceivable that we get into some problems in the future, because unfortunately we don't seem to learn from our mistakes. And what is happening is that in wind and solar at least we have what is called must-run status, which is that wind and solar assets have to keep running. Okay, and everything else can be shut down, but wind and solar have to be given preference in terms of allowing them to run.
If they're producing.
If they're producing, of course. Now, what is happening, however, is that in some of the states, there's so much wind and solar coming in that even if they shut everything else down, they still have too much wind and solar capacity. Okay? And so, therefore, in some states, what happens is that for the stability of the grid, they have to back down even wind and solar. And that is something that we have to make sure does not happen, because that is the death knell for our industry if that does happen. So that is something that we have to keep a very careful watch out for, and make sure that none of the states do an overbuild of wind and solar, which is hard to manage because when everybody is looking for new capacity. So when the state auctions new capacity, everybody rushes in and bids the 255s and the 260s of the world, right? So we're also hungry to get that capacity that nobody really thinks about all of these things. And it's only when the problem comes and hits us in the face that we realize, oh my God, we were too aggressive and we shouldn't have done this, and how could we have made this mistake? So it may happen. Okay?
Storage may be an option.
Yeah, storage, but storage is very expensive right now still. And you can't store beyond a certain point. So today's storage, and as I said, India is such a cost-sensitive market that just supplying renewables at 250 or 3 rupees is competitive, but any cost of storage on top of that will just make the cost go back.
It's surprising because per capita consumption is so low. So why there should be a problem in getting up on that?
Because there is a fundamental problem in India, and that is the distribution companies, which are all owned by the state government. They suppress demand because every unit that they sell, they make a loss on that. So they'd rather not sell any power to service the demand, because the more they sell, the more they lose. So at some point when they reach the cap of their losses, they just cut off the power. That is what happens. So that is the fundamental crux of the Indian power sector.
There's no way to make it up with volume.
Yeah. So this is actually a very good point, and I'm glad you brought it up. We should talk to this point. If an average purchasing price of a discom, the state electricity discom, is say 4 rupees, 50 paisa, and 50% of his electricity is being is going out because of T&D losses or because of theft. So his cost of power is almost 10 rupees, and he's supplying the same power for 8 rupees or 7 rupees. So he can never make money. So this is an inherent problem. So the big challenge in the system today is the state-run discoms and their health. So how long will India, or how long will the government keep funding them? So in fact, me and Sumant were on a program called, I forgot what it is, Champions of Change, where we've been advising the government again and again to privatize and to distribute carriage and content. And I think there is enough noise in the government, and they understand the whole rationale behind making 2 companies rather than 1. And if that happens, I think that will be one of the solutions which will lead to stronger discoms.
So it sounds like we need some institutional disruption as well.
Oh yes.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Hi, I'm Prashant. I work for an investment firm that invests in India. So, the U.S. recently put tariffs on solar panels from China. Can you talk about sort of the impact on us and sort of similar policy in India if it comes to be because they want to develop it? And the second question being, when you think of the policy framework for, you talked about distribution, land acquisition, where do you see sort of policy least developed, and where would you like to see the government this year make some positive sort of steps?
one of the reasons why IT did really well in India is because the government did not know what's happening and they kept out of it. So what do I want from the government? I want them to stay out of my business. That's the very quick and short answer. But the reality is, sorry, I lost my chain of thought.
Tariffs? No, do you see tariffs,
Oh
anti-dumping
yeah,
tariffs
anti-dumping.
in India?
So we do have a safeguard duty which has been announced of 70%. The reality, the current thinking in the government is, today we are importing lots of oil where we send out a lot of forex, and now we started importing a lot of panels where we are again sending out forex, and we're sending them to China of all countries, and the government doesn't like that obviously. So it's very keen to develop its own homegrown solar manufacturing industry. I think today our industry claims it's 5 gigawatt of manufacturing capacity, but I don't think it will be beyond 2. But the government is very keen in the next 3 or 4 years they come up to at least 10 or 15 gigawatt, which might be possible with the safeguard duty. So in the long, as an IPP, I don't want it, but as an Indian citizen, I think it's a good thing that we create our own industry. And so safeguard duty is coming in India.
But do you see that derailing the 2 rupees 50 paisa, and the shift to, the pace of shift?
No, I don't think so, because that 2 rupees 50 paisa will go up to 3 rupees 10 paisa, and it's still lower than 4 rupees. So there's still some room to play there.
But this is the biggest problem the government is facing, which is how to encourage solar manufacturing without disrupting the sector. And our contention is that rather than give a blanket duty that takes the cost of the entire 10,000 megawatts that is going to be installed domestically up to 310 or 350, whatever that number is, it is better to give a direct incentive to those people who set up manufacturing capacity in India. And that way you only do it for the 3,000 or 4,000 megawatts and give them a direct incentive. And so that's a dialogue we're having with the government right now. And obviously there are multiple people who are having multiple conversations, including the manufacturers. But my view is very simple. Why don't you just levy, $100,000 per megawatt that is going to be set up in the next 10 years, and take the money that is collected from there and give an incentive to the people who want to set up manufacturing. So that's a simple way of not increasing the cost by such a large amount. So there are various ways of addressing the problem, but unfortunately the government, it just works with such blunt instruments. It's very hard to find chiseled and proper, targeted answers. And they have only certain ways in which they can work. And they can't work in really flexible ways that are required to find policy solutions in a sector that is so dynamically evolving as ours is. And that is one of the fundamental problems that we have, actually.
We have time for one more. Yes.
My question is for you, Dr. Shukla. You spoke about carbon capture, so I understood that is either carbon sequestration or carbon markets. So what are your thoughts on both of the sequestration and pricing of carbon or taxing of carbon in India?
Yeah, so taxing of carbon is of course a finance question. I'm not an expert. That definitely will help. I was referring to the carbon sequestration. And there are several technologies now, and you might have seen, there are about 3 or 4 major companies which are trying. And if we have to bend that curve, the one that, if we want to go, we have to invest in negative emissions. Yes, we have to get to the negative emissions. And that's something that is not, that will be one thing that India could really very seriously get involved with. That was the point. That technology is developing. But in order to meet that 2 degrees, in order to, the way it is increasing, by the way, you are very definite, it is definitely going to happen. We are very optimistic. We think that maybe some technology will develop, maybe there will be some sense will prevail, maybe elections will help. But no, definitely, carbon capture has to be one of the very high priorities.
So it will happen in India, sequestration?
Well, that was my wishful thinking,
Okay.
that it should happen.
Quick follow-up. How hard would the barrier to entry for a new novel carbon capture technology be to entry into the market? How much barrier to entry for new technologies would there be? A new carbon capture technology, an investment. Where does the investment come from, really?
Yeah, I'm not an expert on that, but let me tell you that at least I know one technology company in USA which is trying their best to be able to set up a pilot project And they have run into a lot of bureaucratic problems with the Ministry of Economic Affairs, and because they are not able to open the license right away. You are absolutely right. That is a barrier. There is a barrier.
I think our time is up. Let me thank you first and foremost for the opportunity to be here with you for an hour. This is really a stellar panel, and I learned a lot about what's going on in India and also implications for the world. So let's give a round of applause to and also thank you very much, Diane, for organizing the panel in the first place. It was really a great idea.
Thanks everyone for being here and for your wonderful questions, and thank you to the panel. This was a really great discussion. Thanks so much for being here.
Global warming. No. It's not going to get without the transmission and distribution companies. Utility scale is not feasible. They're both utility scale. So without, so there you go, microgrid, forget it.
The thing that occurred to me though in the slides he was showing, it has been a lot warmer in the past when the sea levels were a lot higher. I mean,
That's east of Ecuador.
yeah, we didn't have a big solution.
Maybe, yeah. In US, it's like Boston, rain. You might use the guarantee of money to rain is there. So,
Is this your field?
I invest in sustainable companies. So I work in
Is that what brings you to the